The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Queen Elizabeth walked slowly through the rose garden she had tended for over 60 years. Her weathered hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly as she reached out to touch the delicate petals of her favorite white roses. The garden had been her sanctuary, her place of peace during the most challenging moments of her reign. Today was different. Today carried the weight of finality that she had been dreading for months. The doctors had been gentle but clear in their assessment. The treatments were no longer working, and the time had come to prepare for what they delicately called the transition. She preferred to think of it as her final act of service to the crown and to the people who had trusted her with their hopes and dreams for decades. Prince William found her there, sitting on the old wooden bench that his grandfather had installed decades ago. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb what he recognized as a moment of private reflection. His grandmother had always been a pillar of strength, but today he could see the vulnerability in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if carrying an invisible weight. "Grandmother," he said softly, taking a seat beside her on the bench. The wood creaked slightly under their combined weight, a sound that had become familiar over the years of family conversations held in this very spot. She turned to him with a smile that still held traces of the young woman who had once danced at state balls and charmed world leaders with her wit and intelligence. "William, my dear boy, I was just thinking about your grandfather. He loved this garden almost as much as I do. He used to say that roses were like the monarchy. They required patience, care, and the wisdom to know when to prune away what no longer served." The prince felt a tightness in his chest as he processed her words. The metaphor was not lost on him. His grandmother had always possessed an uncanny ability to speak in layers, to convey multiple meanings with simple observations. Today, he sensed she was preparing him for something far greater than a gardening lesson. "The Prime Minister is coming this afternoon," she continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to share. "There are arrangements to be made, protocols to be observed. But before we deal with all of that, I want to talk to you about what comes next." William had known this day would come, but the reality of it felt surreal. His grandmother had been the only monarch most people alive had ever known. She had been a constant in a world of endless change, a symbol of stability and tradition that had weathered wars, scandals, political upheaval, and social transformation. The thought of the monarchy without her seemed impossible to imagine. "I'm not ready," he admitted, the words coming out more raw and honest than he had intended. "I don't know how anyone could be ready for this." The queen reached over and placed her hand on his, her touch still warm and reassuring. "None of us are ever truly ready for the moments that define our lives. William, I certainly wasn't ready when I was 25, and suddenly, faced with a crown I had never expected to wear so young. But readiness isn't about feeling prepared. It's about choosing to step forward when duty calls, even when everything inside you wants to run in the opposite direction." She paused, her eyes distant as memories flickered across her mind like scenes from an old film. "I remember the morning I learned my father had died. I was in Kenya, watching elephants at a watering hole, completely unaware that my life had changed forever. One moment, I was a young wife, enjoying an adventure with my husband, and the next I was Queen of England. There was no time for grief, no time to process what had happened. There was only the crown and the weight of responsibility it carried." William listened intently, recognizing that his grandmother was sharing more personal detail than she usually allowed herself. She had always been intensely private about her feelings, believing that the monarchy required a certain emotional distance from the public. But today, that reserve seemed to be melting away, revealing the human being behind the crown. "The hardest part," she continued, "wasn't learning the protocols or memorizing the constitutional requirements. It was understanding that from that moment forward, my life belonged to something larger than myself. Every decision, every word, every gesture would be scrutinized and judged not just for what it revealed about me, but for what it said about the institution I represented." The garden around them seemed to hold its breath as she spoke. Even the birds had fallen silent, as if nature itself recognized the importance of this conversation. William found himself studying his grandmother's face, memorizing every line and expression, knowing that these moments were precious and finite. "But here's what I learned over the years," the Queen said, her voice growing stronger. "The crown doesn't diminish you. It reveals who you truly are. All the training in the world can't prepare you for the moment when you realize that millions of people are looking to you for hope, for stability, for something to believe in. That's when you discover what you're really made of." She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful despite her age. Walking over to a particularly beautiful rose bush, she carefully selected a single white bloom and brought it back to where William sat. "Your grandfather planted this variety the year you were born. He said he wanted something beautiful to mark the arrival of his first grandson. Every year since then, these roses have bloomed without fail, regardless of drought, frost, or disease. They endure because their roots run deep." William accepted the rose, understanding the symbolism she was offering him. His roots in this institution, in this family, in this responsibility, ran deeper than his fears or doubts. He was part of something that had existed for over 1,000 years, something that would continue long after he was gone. "There's something else I need to tell you," the Queen said, settling back onto the bench. Her expression grew more serious, and William could see the effort it took for her to find the right words. "The doctors believe I have perhaps 6 months, possibly less. We'll keep this private for now, but eventually the public will need to know. The transition will need to be handled carefully with dignity and respect for what this change means to our people." The words hit William like a physical blow. 6 months. The woman who had been the cornerstone of his world for his entire life would be gone in 6 months. He felt the rose stem between his fingers and focused on its thorns, using the small points of pain to ground himself in the moment. "What do you need from me?" he asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "I need you to help me say goodbye," she replied simply. "Not just to the family, but to the nation. We have 6 months to prepare our people for this transition, to help them understand that while one chapter is ending, another is beginning. I want to use this time to visit places that have been important to me, to thank the people who have served alongside me, and to ensure that when the time comes, our subjects feel confident in what lies ahead." William nodded, understanding that she was asking him to be part of something unprecedented. No monarch in recent history had been able to plan their farewell in this way. Usually, death came suddenly, leaving the nation to process grief and transition simultaneously. His grandmother was offering him and the country a different kind of gift, the opportunity to say goodbye with intention and grace. "We'll start with Scotland next week," she said, pulling out a small notebook that William recognized as one of many she had used throughout her reign to keep track of appointments and observations. "I want to visit the places where your grandfather and I were happiest. The castle in Balmoral, the villages where we walked together, the people who knew us not as monarchs, but as neighbors." As she spoke about her plans, William could see a spark return to her eyes. This wasn't just about ending something. It was about celebrating what had been built over a lifetime of service. She was approaching her final months with the same sense of duty and purpose that had defined her entire reign. "And after Scotland?" he asked. "Wales, where father learned what it means to serve. Then to Northern Ireland, to acknowledge the peace that has been one of the greatest achievements of my reign. And finally, we'll return to London for whatever farewells need to happen there." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the garden, creating patterns of light and shadow on the gravel paths. William realized that they had been talking for hours, and yet it felt like mere minutes. Time had a different quality when you knew it was limited. "Grandmother," he said finally, "how do you say goodbye to a nation?" She smiled, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of the mischievous young princess who had once driven trucks during World War II and insisted on dancing at her wedding despite protocol concerns. "Very carefully, my dear boy, and with as much love as we can possibly manage." As they walked back toward the palace together, William felt the weight of what lay ahead settling on his shoulders. But alongside the fear and sadness, he also felt something else, a sense of privilege of being chosen to witness and participate in this extraordinary farewell. His grandmother was teaching him one final lesson about what it meant to serve with dignity, and he was determined to learn it well. The train journey to Scotland had always been one of Queen Elizabeth's favorite ways to travel. Unlike the formal ceremonies that surrounded most royal transportation, the royal train offered a sense of privacy and reflection that she cherished. As the English countryside rolled past her window, she found herself thinking about all the times she had made this journey over the decades, sometimes for official duties, sometimes for holidays, and now for what she knew would be her final tour of the kingdom she had served for so long. Prince Charles sat across from her in the comfortable compartment, reviewing briefing papers for their upcoming engagements. At 75, he had waited longer than any heir in British history to assume the throne, and now that the transition was imminent, she could see both anticipation and apprehension in his careful preparations. He had been preparing for this role his entire life, but no amount of preparation could truly ready someone for the actual weight of the crown. "The Lord Lieutenant of Aberdeenshire has arranged for us to visit Mrs. MacLeod," Charles said, looking up from his papers. "She's 93 and has been the postmistress in Ballater for over 60 years. She apparently has some stories she'd like to share with you." The Queen smiled at this news. These were the encounters she treasured most, conversations with ordinary people who had witnessed history from their own unique perspectives. Mrs. MacLeod would have seen the royal family not as distant figures from newspaper headlines, but as regular customers who came into her post office for stamps and local gossip. "I remember her," the Queen said, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "She always insisted on personally weighing every package, even the official correspondence from Balmoral. Your father used to joke that she was more thorough than the royal household staff." As the train continued north, both mother and son fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what this journey represented. For Charles, it was a chance to observe his mother in what might be her final official capacity, to learn whatever last lessons she had to offer about leadership and service. For the Queen, it was an opportunity to revisit the places and people who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be truly connected to the nation she served. When they arrived in Aberdeen, the small crowd that had gathered at the station was notably different from the usual royal welcomes. Instead of the carefully orchestrated events that typically surrounded royal visits, this felt more like a neighborhood gathering. People had brought their children and grandchildren homemade signs and flowers from their own gardens. The mood was both celebratory and poignant, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something historic and unrepeatable. Margaret Fraser, a local schoolteacher who had met the Queen during a previous visit 15 years earlier, stepped forward with a small bouquet of Scottish heather. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for our country. My students made these thank you cards for you." The Queen accepted the flowers and cards with genuine warmth, taking time to examine each child's artwork and handwriting. One card particularly caught her attention, a drawing of a crown surrounded by hearts, with the words, "Thank you for being our Queen," written in careful block letters. She held it up for Charles to see, and he could observe the profound effect these simple gestures had on his mother. "Please tell your students that their cards will have a place of honor in my private study," she told Mrs. Fraser, "and remind them that the greatest service they can perform for their country is to be kind to one another and to care for their communities." The drive to Balmoral took them through some of the most beautiful countryside in Scotland. The autumn colors were at their peak, with golden birches and crimson maples creating a tapestry against the dark green of the pine forests. The Queen had made this drive countless times, but today she seemed to be seeing every detail with fresh eyes, as if she were storing up memories for a journey she would soon have to take alone. At Balmoral, the staff had assembled in the main hall for an informal greeting. These were people who had served the royal family for decades, some following in the footsteps of parents and grandparents who had worked on the estate. They knew the queen not as a distant monarch, but as someone who asked about their families, remembered their anniversaries, and sent flowers when they lost loved ones. James Robertson, the head gamekeeper, had worked at Balmoral for 42 years. His father and grandfather had held the same position before him. As the queen shook his hand, she asked about his daughter, who had recently started university in Edinburgh. "She's studying history, Your Majesty," he said with obvious pride. "Says she wants to write about the social changes she's witnessed during your reign." "How wonderful," the queen replied. "Perhaps when she's finished her studies, she might consider applying for a position in the Royal Archives. We need young historians who understand that the real story of any era lies not in the grand ceremonies, but in the daily lives of ordinary people doing extraordinary things." That evening, the queen took her traditional walk around the estate grounds. Charles accompanied her, along with a small security detail that maintained a respectful distance. The conversation between mother and son was quiet and personal, touching on memories they shared of family holidays at Balmoral, discussions about the future of the monarchy, and the particular challenges that Charles would face as king. "You know," the queen said as they paused by the River Dee, "your great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, used to walk along this same path. She wrote in her journals about how the Scottish landscape helped her process grief after Prince Albert's death. She found something healing about the permanence of these mountains and rivers, the way they endured regardless of human sorrows or celebrations." Charles understood that his mother was drawing parallels between Victoria's experience of loss and her own current journey toward the end of life. Both queens had found solace in the natural world, in landscapes that existed beyond the concerns of politics and protocol. "Mother," he said carefully, "are you afraid?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm not afraid of dying, if that's what you're asking. I've lived longer and more fully than most people dare to hope. What concerns me is whether I've prepared our nation adequately for what comes next. The monarchy will survive my death, but will it continue to serve the people as effectively as it should?" "You've given us the strongest possible foundation," Charles assured her. "The example you've set, the traditions you've maintained while allowing for necessary change, the way you've shown that duty and compassion can coexist, all of that will endure." The next morning brought the visit to Mrs. MacLeod's post office in Ballater. The 93-year-old postmistress had prepared for this meeting with the same attention to detail she had brought to her job for 6 decades. Despite her age, her mind was sharp and her memory for details remarkable. "Your Majesty," she said as the queen entered the small post office, "I've been thinking about what I wanted to say to you, and I keep coming back to something that happened about 20 years ago." She led them to a corner of the shop where she kept her personal records. "There was a terrible storm that winter, and the roads were impassable for days. People in the village were worried about heating oil and supplies. You were staying at Balmoral at the time, and somehow you learned about our situation." Mrs. MacLeod pulled out a faded letter from a wooden box. "This is the note you sent with your staff when they came to check on us. You wrote, 'Please let me know if there is anything Balmoral can do to help our neighbors during this difficult time. Not the royal household or the palace staff, but anything Balmoral can do.' You understood that you weren't just visiting our community, you were part of it." The queen remembered the incident clearly. It had seemed natural to her to offer whatever assistance the castle could provide. The royal estates had resources that could help during emergencies, and she had never seen any reason why those resources shouldn't be shared with the people who lived and worked nearby. "What struck me most," Mrs. MacLeod continued, "was that you never made any public announcement about it. There were no photographers, no newspaper stories about royal charity. You just quietly made sure that everyone had what they needed and then went on with your holiday as if nothing unusual had happened." Charles listened to this story with fascination. He had heard many tales of his mother's private acts of kindness over the years, but she rarely spoke about them herself. To her, these gestures were simply part of what it meant to live responsibly within a community. "That's the kind of queen you've been," Mrs. MacLeod said, her voice growing emotional. Not someone who rules from a distance, but someone who understands that true leadership means caring for the people around you, even when nobody's watching. As they prepared to leave the post office, Mrs. McLeod pressed a small package into the Queen's hands. "I've been saving this for 60 years, she explained. "It's a piece of shortbread from my grandmother's recipe, the same recipe she used when Queen Victoria visited this area. I thought you might like to have something that connects you to all the queens who came before you." The Queen accepted the gift with visible emotion. These connections across time, these threads that linked her reign to those of her predecessors, meant more to her than any formal ceremony or state banquet. They represented the continuity that lay at the heart of what the monarchy was meant to provide, a sense that some things endured, even as everything else changed. That afternoon, they visited the local school where the Queen had presented awards to outstanding students during a previous visit. The children who had been 8-year-olds then were now young adults, some with children of their own. The headmaster had arranged for several of these former students to meet with the Queen and share how that earlier encounter had influenced their lives. Sarah Mitchell, now a doctor working in rural Scotland, spoke about how the Queen's visit had inspired her to pursue medicine. "You told us that day that the most important thing we could do with our education was to find ways to help others. I never forgot those words, and they guided me through all my years of medical school." Another former student, now a teacher himself, talked about how the Queen's emphasis on community service had shaped his career choice. "You made us understand that serving others wasn't just something that royal people did. It was something that all of us could do in our own ways." As the day drew to a close, the Queen reflected on how these encounters were revealing something profound about the nature of leadership and influence. The formal speeches she had given to Parliament and world leaders would be recorded in history books, but these smaller moments, the encouragement given to children, the support offered to neighbors during difficult times, might have had a more lasting impact on individual lives. The train journey back to London was quiet and contemplative. Both the Queen and Charles understood that they had witnessed something precious during their time in Scotland, a demonstration of the deep, personal connections that could exist between a monarch and her people when both sides approached the relationship with genuine care and respect. "What did you learn today?" the Queen asked her son as the Scottish countryside faded into evening shadows. "I learned that being a good monarch isn't about grand gestures or perfect speeches," Charles replied thoughtfully. "It's about paying attention to the small moments and understanding that every interaction matters because you never know which conversation might change someone's life." The Queen nodded, satisfied that this lesson had been understood. Tomorrow they would continue their farewell journey, but tonight she felt confident that the values that had guided her reign would continue to guide those who came after her. The rain was falling steadily on the Welsh countryside as the royal motorcade made its way through the narrow valley roads toward Llangollen. Queen Elizabeth watched the familiar landscape through the car window, remembering the many times she had traveled these same routes during her decades of visits to Wales. The gray sky and persistent drizzle seemed fitting for what she knew would be her final official tour of a country that had always held a special place in her heart. Prince William sat beside her, having joined the farewell tour for this leg of the journey. She had specifically requested his presence in Wales, wanting him to understand the deep connection between the royal family and the Welsh people. This relationship had been tested and strengthened over the years, evolving from the formal obligations of constitutional monarchy to something more genuine and mutually respectful. "Do you remember your first visit to Wales?" the Queen asked William as they drove through a small village where people had gathered despite the weathered away from doorways and shop fronts. "I was 7, William replied, smiling at the memory. "You and Grandfather took me to see the castle at Caerphilly. I was convinced that dragons might still be living in the ruins. Your grandfather encouraged that fantasy," the Queen remembered fondly. "He told you stories about Welsh dragons for the entire trip. I think he enjoyed your imagination almost as much as you did." The conversation was interrupted as their car pulled into the grounds of a residential care facility in a converted Victorian mansion. This wasn't on any official schedule, but the Queen had specifically requested this stop. She had learned that several former royal household staff members were now residents here, people who had served the royal family for decades before retiring to Wales. Inside the facility, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming despite the institutional setting. The staff had decorated the common room with photographs from various royal visits over the years, creating an informal museum of shared memories. Residents who were able had gathered in wheelchairs and comfortable chairs, their faces showing excitement and emotion at this unexpected visit. Bronwyn Jones, age 89, had worked as a seamstress for the royal household for 35 years. Her arthritis-gnarled hands had once crafted elaborate gowns for state occasions and carefully mended everyday clothes for the royal children. When the Queen approached her chair, Mrs. Jones attempted to stand, but the Queen gently encouraged her to remain seated. "Bronwyn," the Queen said warmly, "I remember the beautiful christening gown you made for William. The detail work was extraordinary." Mrs. Jones' eyes filled with tears. "Your Majesty, you remember that? It was such a small thing." "It wasn't small at all," the Queen replied firmly. "Every stitch represented care and dedication. That gown became a family heirloom because of your skill." As she spoke with each former employee, the Queen demonstrated the remarkable memory for personal details that had characterized her entire reign. She asked about grandchildren by name, remembered favorite recipes that the kitchen staff had prepared, and recalled specific incidents from years past that showed her genuine attention to the people who had served alongside her. Thomas Williams, a former groundskeeper from one of the Welsh royal estates, shared a story that captured the essence of the Queen's character. "There was a terrible storm one winter that brought down several old oak trees on the estate. I was heartbroken because those trees had been there for over 200 years. Your Majesty found me sitting among the fallen branches, and instead of ordering the cleanup, you sat down next to me and helped me identify which branches could be saved for woodworking projects." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "You could have sent staff to deal with it, but you understood that sometimes people need to grieve for beautiful things that are lost. You helped me see that the trees could have a new life as furniture and artwork." William listened to these stories with growing appreciation for his grandmother's approach to leadership. She had understood intuitively that the people who worked for the royal family were not simply employees, but collaborators in maintaining traditions and creating experiences that would outlast any individual reign. After leaving the care facility, they drove to Cardiff for a more formal engagement at the Welsh Parliament building. The Senedd had arranged for a small ceremony recognizing the Queen's contribution to Welsh cultural preservation and economic development during her reign. Unlike typical parliamentary addresses, this event had been designed as a conversation rather than a formal speech. Carys Llewellyn, the current First Minister of Wales, introduced the Queen to a group of young Welsh entrepreneurs, artists, and community leaders who represented the new generation that would shape Wales's future. The Queen had specifically requested this format, wanting to hear from people who were building rather than simply celebrating the past. Rhiannon Davies, a 28-year-old social worker from Swansea, spoke about programs that were addressing rural isolation among elderly Welsh speakers. "Your Majesty," she said, "the work you've done to support Welsh language preservation has created a foundation that we're building on. My grandmother was one of the last native speakers in her village, and now her great-grandchildren are learning Welsh in school again." The Queen asked thoughtful questions about how technology was being used to connect isolated communities, how traditional Welsh crafts were being adapted for modern markets, and what challenges young people faced in balancing respect for heritage with the need for economic opportunity. Her questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of contemporary Welsh issues that surprised some of the younger participants. Gareth Thomas, a renewable energy engineer, explained how Wales was becoming a leader in sustainable technology development. "The investments in education and infrastructure that happened during your reign created the foundation for what we're doing now," he told her. "We're proving that environmental responsibility and economic success can go hand in hand." As the afternoon progressed, William observed how his grandmother's conversation style encouraged people to share their real thoughts rather than diplomatic pleasantries. She asked follow-up questions that showed genuine curiosity, acknowledged challenges honestly, and offered encouragement that felt personal rather than generic. During a quiet moment between meetings, William asked his grandmother about her approach to these conversations. How do you get people to open up so quickly? They're telling you things they probably don't share with reporters or politicians. Because I'm not asking them to convince me of anything, she replied. Politicians want to be persuaded, and journalists want to find stories. I'm simply interested in understanding their experience. When people feel heard rather than judged, they tend to be more honest. The final engagement of the day was perhaps the most personally meaningful for the Queen. They visited a small village school where she had established a scholarship program 25 years earlier. The program provided educational support for children from farming families who wanted to pursue higher education but might not otherwise have the financial means to do so. Dr. Megan Pritchard, now a university professor, had been one of the first scholarship recipients. She greeted the Queen with a mixture of professional composure and personal gratitude that was deeply moving to witness. Your Majesty, Dr. Pritchard said, I want you to know that your scholarship didn't just change my life. It changed my family's entire trajectory. I was able to become the first person in my family to attend university, and now my younger brother is studying engineering, and my sister is in medical school. The Queen listened as Dr. Pritchard explained how the scholarship program had evolved over the years. We've learned that financial support alone isn't enough, she said. We also needed mentoring programs, study groups, and help with the social adjustment to university life. The program has grown beyond anything you originally envisioned. Current scholarship recipients, ranging in age from 16 to 22, have prepared presentations about their academic pursuits and career goals. The Queen listened to each one with focused attention, asking questions that revealed her understanding of the specific challenges facing rural Welsh students in contemporary higher education. 18-year-old David Evans spoke about his plans to study agricultural science and return to help modernize his family's farm. I want to use new technology to make farming more sustainable, but I also want to preserve the traditional knowledge that my grandfather taught me. Your scholarship is making it possible for me to learn both. The Queen nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need, respect for tradition combined with openness to innovation. Your grandfather's wisdom and your education can work together to create something stronger than either alone. As the evening drew to a close, the scholarship recipients performed traditional Welsh songs that their music teacher had specially arranged for the occasion. The harmonies filled the small school hall with a sound that seemed to embody everything the Queen valued about Welsh culture. Beauty emerging from shared effort, tradition serving as a foundation for creativity, and community created through common purpose. Later, during the drive back to their accommodation, William reflected on what he had observed during the day. I'm beginning to understand something about leadership that I hadn't fully grasped before, he told his grandmother. What's that? She asked. It's not about having all the answers or making grand pronouncements. It's about creating space for other people to discover their own solutions and then supporting them in whatever way you can. The Queen smiled, recognizing that William was learning one of the most important lessons of effective leadership. The monarchy's greatest power, she said, lies not in what we can command, but in what we can inspire. When people feel genuinely supported in their efforts to build something better, they often exceed what anyone thought possible. That night, as she prepared for bed in the comfortable guest quarters that had been arranged for their stay, the Queen reflected on the day's encounters. Each conversation had revealed something hopeful about Wales's future while honoring the foundations that had been built over decades of careful attention to education, cultural preservation, and economic development. She thought about Dr. Pritchard's scholarship program, which had grown beyond its original scope to become a model for educational support in rural communities. She remembered young David Evans, who understood that innovation and tradition could strengthen each other rather than competing. She recalled the enthusiasm of the social worker who was using new technology to preserve old languages, and the engineer who saw environmental protection as an economic opportunity. These young people represented everything she had hoped to achieve during her reign, a generation that understood their heritage, embraced change thoughtfully, and committed themselves to serving something larger than their individual ambitions. Wales, like Scotland, was demonstrating that the future of the United Kingdom lay in the hands of people who could honor the past while fearlessly creating new possibilities. As rain continued to fall gently against the windows, the Queen felt a deep sense of satisfaction about this part of her farewell journey. Wales had shown her that the values she had tried to embody and promote during her reign were alive and flourishing in the work of a new generation. Tomorrow would bring new encounters and fresh insights, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she was leaving behind something stronger and more hopeful than what she had inherited. The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the London Thames as Queen Elizabeth stood at her private study window in Buckingham Palace, watching the city slowly come to life. 6 months had passed since that conversation with William in the Rose Garden, and today marked the beginning of what would be her final week of public engagements. The farewell tour through Scotland and Wales had been emotionally overwhelming and deeply satisfying, but returning to London meant confronting the reality of final goodbyes in the most formal and public way possible. Her private secretary, Sir Edward Thornton, entered quietly with the morning briefings and a cup of Earl Grey tea prepared exactly as she preferred it. He had served in this role for 15 years, and they had developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and unspoken understanding. Today, his usual professional demeanor was tinged with an emotion that he was struggling to contain. "Your Majesty," he said, setting the documents on her desk with unusual care, "the arrangements for this week are finalized. The Prime Minister will arrive at 11 for your final weekly audience. The Archbishop of Canterbury has requested a private meeting before the Thanksgiving service on Thursday, and the Commonwealth representatives have all confirmed their attendance for Saturday's reception." The Queen nodded, understanding that each of these appointments represented not just the completion of constitutional duties, but the formal conclusion of relationships that had shaped her reign. The weekly meetings with prime ministers had been a constant throughout her 70-year tenure, providing continuity and institutional memory across 15 different governments. These conversations had often been the most intellectually stimulating part of her role, offering insights into the complex challenges facing the nation. "Has the Prime Minister indicated what she wishes to discuss during our final meeting?" the Queen asked. "I believe she wants to present you with a bound collection of letters from world leaders, Your Majesty. Apparently, she's been secretly collecting messages of gratitude from heads of state, and the collection has grown far beyond what anyone anticipated." The Queen found herself touched by this gesture. Throughout her reign, she had maintained careful correspondence with leaders around the world, offering congratulations for achievements, condolences for tragedies, and quiet diplomatic support during difficult periods. The idea that these leaders had taken time to reflect on these relationships and express their appreciation meant more to her than any formal state honor. Prince Philip's former valet, James Morrison, appeared in the doorway with a small wrapped package. Though the Duke had passed away several years earlier, James had remained as part of the household staff, helping to maintain the personal spaces that still held Philip's presence. "Your Majesty," James said softly, "I found this among His Royal Highness's papers. It's marked for Elizabeth's final week. He must have prepared it some time ago." The Queen accepted the package with hands that trembled slightly. Philip had always possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate important moments and prepare thoughtful responses. Even in death, he was still caring for her in ways that demonstrated the depth of their partnership. Inside the wrapping was a small leather-bound journal and a letter written in Philip's familiar handwriting. The letter was brief, but characteristic of his direct, loving communication style. "My dearest Elizabeth," it read, "if you're reading this, then you're approaching the end of something that has been the center of both our lives for longer than most people can imagine. I want you to know that watching you serve our nation and the Commonwealth has been the greatest privilege of my life. The journal contains some memories I wanted to preserve for you. Moments when I saw you being exactly the queen our country needed, even when you might have doubted yourself. You have been magnificent, my darling. Rest well when the time comes. Philip. She opened the journal to find pages of Philip's observations about specific moments from their shared decades of service. He had recorded her response to the Aberfan disaster, her handling of the constitutional crisis during the 1970s, her speech following Princess Diana's death, and dozens of smaller incidents that revealed her character under pressure. Reading his words, she realized he had been creating a record of her reign through the eyes of someone who knew her both as a monarch and as a woman. The arrival of the Prime Minister interrupted her reading, though she carefully placed the journal in her desk drawer where she could return to it later. Prime Minister Sarah Richardson was the 15th leader to hold weekly audiences with the Queen, and their relationship had developed a warmth that transcended the formal constitutional requirements. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister said as she entered the private audience room, "I hardly know how to begin this conversation. How does one properly thank someone who has been the steady center of our national life for 7 decades? The Queen gestured for her to take the familiar chair across from her desk. These weekly meetings had followed the same format for 70 years, providing a forum for confidential discussion between the head of state and the head of government. Today's conversation would be their last, but the Queen wanted it to feel as natural and substantive as all the others. "Perhaps we should talk about the future rather than dwelling on the past," the Queen suggested. "What are your hopes for the monarchy as it transitions to new leadership?" The Prime Minister leaned forward, clearly having given this question considerable thought. "I hope that King Charles will continue the approach you've perfected, being above politics while remaining engaged with the real challenges facing our citizens. You've shown us that the monarchy can be both traditional and adaptable, both dignified and accessible." Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics from constitutional precedents to the changing role of the Commonwealth in global affairs. The Queen offered insights based on her decades of experience, while the Prime Minister shared her perspectives on the political and social changes that would shape the next era of British history. As their meeting concluded, the Prime Minister presented the bound collection of letters she had mentioned. The volume was larger than expected, containing messages from over 100 world leaders spanning multiple generations. Some were from current heads of state, while others were from leaders who had worked with the Queen decades earlier, and one of their gratitude included in this historic collection. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister said as she prepared to leave, "I want you to know that you've been an inspiration not just to our nation, but to everyone who has had the privilege of working with you. You've shown us that leadership can be both powerful and humble, that duty and compassion are not competing values, but complementary strengths." That afternoon brought a more private but equally meaningful encounter. Lady Susan Hussey, who had served as the Queen's lady-in-waiting for over 60 years, came for what would be their final official meeting. Their relationship had evolved from formal courtier service to something approaching true friendship, built on shared experiences and mutual respect that had deepened over decades. "Ma'am," Lady Susan said, using the informal address that had become natural between them over the years, "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you, and I keep coming back to something that happened about 30 years ago." She settled into the comfortable chair that had been designated as hers during their regular afternoon conversations. "Do you remember the state visit from the Romanian president, just after the fall of communism? There was that terrible mix-up with the protocol, and the visiting delegation was left standing in the wrong receiving room for nearly an hour." The Queen smiled, remembering the incident clearly. "I found them there looking completely bewildered and rather offended." "Yes, and instead of sending staff to sort it out, you personally escorted them to the correct location, apologizing and making conversation as if you had all the time in the world. But what struck me was how you used that walk to ask about their families, about the changes happening in their country, about their hopes for the future." Lady Susan paused, her voice growing emotional. "By the time you delivered them to the state dining room, They weren't offended guests who had been inconvenienced. They were friends who had been welcomed. You turned a diplomatic embarrassment into a moment of genuine human connection. That's what you've done throughout your reign, she continued. You've understood that the real work of monarchy happens in those unscripted moments when people see who you truly are. You've never hidden behind a crown. You've used it as a platform for kindness. The Queen found herself deeply moved by this observation. Throughout her reign, she had struggled to balance the formal requirements of her role with her instinct for direct, personal engagement with people. Hearing Lady Susan describe these efforts as successful and meaningful provided a sense of validation that formal praise could never offer. As evening approached, the Queen made her way to the palace gardens for what had become a nightly ritual during these final weeks. The rose garden where her farewell journey had begun was now dormant in the late autumn air, but she found peace in walking the familiar paths where she had processed so many important decisions over the years. Prince William found her there, as she had known he would. Their evening conversations had become precious to both of them during these months of transition, offering opportunities for final lessons and shared reflections that would not be possible once the formalities of succession began. "How are you feeling about Thursday's service?" William asked, referring to the Thanksgiving ceremony at Westminster Abbey that would serve as the most public moment of her farewell. "Grateful," she replied simply, "not just for what the service represents, but for having the opportunity to say goodbye in this way. Most monarchs don't get to participate in their own farewell. They die unexpectedly, and others have to interpret what they might have wanted to say." They walked slowly along the gravel paths, their conversation touching on practical matters of succession and more philosophical questions about the nature of service and duty. William was asking questions that revealed his deep thinking about how to adapt the monarchy for contemporary challenges while preserving its essential character. "Grandmother," he said as they paused near the bench where their farewell journey had begun, "what do you want people to remember about your reign?" She considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer might influence how he approached his own future responsibilities. "I hope they remember that we tried to serve with dignity and humility, that we understood the monarchy exists for the people, not the other way around, and that even in difficult times, there are always reasons for hope if you're willing to look for them." As they prepared to return to the palace, the Queen reflected on how much had changed since that morning conversation in this same garden 6 months ago. The fear and uncertainty she had felt then had been replaced by a sense of completion and peace. The farewell tour had shown her that the values she had tried to embody during her reign were alive and flourishing in the people she was leaving behind. "William," she said as they reached the palace in trance, "tomorrow we'll begin the formal ceremonies that will mark the end of my reign. But I want you to remember that what we've shared during these past months, the conversations, the encounters with our people, the quiet moments of reflection, these are what matter most. The crown is just a symbol. The real work of monarchy lies in how we choose to serve each other." That night, as she prepared for bed, the Queen returned to Philip's journal. His observations about her handling of various crises and celebrations provided a perspective on her reign that she could never have gained on her own. Through his eyes, she could see moments of strength and wisdom that she had experienced only as uncertainty and the weight of responsibility. Reading his words, she understood that she had indeed been the monarch her country needed, not because she had been perfect, but because she had approached each challenge with genuine care for her people's welfare. Tomorrow would bring new ceremonial obligations and public farewells, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she had served faithfully and well. The final phase of her extraordinary reign was beginning, and she faced it with the same grace and determination that had characterized her entire life of service. The crown would soon pass to new hands, but the example she had set and the relationship she had built would endure long after the formal ceremonies were complete.